This might end up being a long one. I've talked before about how growing up in the 80s and 90s, the channels for getting information were limited, and there were gatekeepers. So there was kind of a common conditioning. And any subversive ideas were extremely difficult to spread. They never really did gain a foothold. It was always just fringe stuff, no matter, what road you went down. If it wasn't advocated by the mainstream, then it was going to be fringe and a tiny subset. And of course, the internet has changed that. And the authoritarians and coercive collectivists have awakened to the danger of information. I mean, they were already awake to it, they just lost control of it. And now they're trying to bring us back into that world of limited information that's curated to their slant. I mean, there are some people who never did leave that world. But for those of us who are being exposed to a wide variety of ideas by virtue of the internet, they want to close that down, it looks like. It just seems like a lot of things are coming to a head right now. Like, enough people have spied the man behind the curtain that there's either going to be a massive crackdown or a massive change. But there are things in motion, there are collisions that can't be avoided. Like, there are escalation chains that are going to beg for a resolution. I don't think the genie is going back in the bottle. Moving on to other topics. I don't know if some biologist or eugenicist has come up with this idea already, but I've become interested in senescence, or lack thereof, in some animals. Senescence is when a creature reaches a certain age and exits its reproductive years and then physically declines. There are some animals that don't experience senescence. They have the ability to be fertile and ambulatory into old age, and they have no definite decline before death. So I think crocodiles are a bit like this, certain turtles and tortoises. In most species, there's no selective pressure that applies subsequent to the breeding years. As long as you breed when you're young and pass on your genes, there's no benefit to living much beyond that at a species level. In fact, in an environment where things can change rapidly, requiring response to selective pressures, there's an advantage to not having a lot of old survivors around. For one thing, that makes for a higher population and thus more stress on the food supply. And another, it can slow down the rate of adaptations, and that new mutations can be diluted away by genetic contributions from the meetings of ancient specimens. Looking at the species that have negligible senescence, we see that they live in environments that don't change much. So, for example, Greenland and sleeper sharks, they can live to be over 600 years old. Their environment is very stable. Giant tortoises also breed throughout their entire lives and continue growing, and they exhibit little senescence. And they live in a fairly stable environment, an island where they aren't subject to predation. So these creatures are optimally adapted to their environments. It's possible that if you were optimally adapted to an environment that didn't change, there would be no advantage to new mutations, as the form would already be perfected relative to its environment. This means mutations would disappear quickly because they would all be suboptimal. I'm just conjecturing here, but I would think the propensity to have mutations may coincide with the propensity to have cancer. So if by virtue of the species already being perfected for its environment, the propensity for mutations fell away because there was no advantage to having them, then there would be a diminishing in the incidence of cancer. Sharks are very close to perfect for their environment. They have been around for 450 million years. Sharks are less likely than other animals to get cancer, and maybe before we polluted the oceans, they didn't get it much at all. Who knows? But sharks are perfect for their environment, and so have little selective pressure on them, or rather little novel selective pressure on them. They have a baseline of selective pressure that holds them in the form they are. Mutations don't convey advantages to an already perfected species. The disadvantage with this, though, is that when a big change comes to the environment, that species can be more easily wiped out because they don't have a wide range of mutations. Now, the ocean is an extremely hard place to impact in a way that covers all the animals. So it would seem to follow then that the more wide-ranging a species is, the less selective pressure it would get from sudden environmental changes, because there would always be individuals outside of that impact zone. So you should see less senescence in more wide-ranging species. Human beings have come into a situation where we have heretofore had great selective pressures put upon us, but now not so much. So we can expect a flurry of bad mutations because we have the propensity to mutate. There's a meta-selection process that selects for the propensity to mutate. It has to do with the frequency of selection events. And we have been subject to that by environmental pressures. Now that we have freed ourselves from those pressures, mutations that would have either helped us adapt or disappeared very quickly are still manifesting in our population, but they are not becoming dominant because they confer no advantage. Although it's possible that we will have selection processes for different types of brains as we progress in this absence of selection pressure on our bodies, the bodies may become debilitated because we don't need them to be any certain way to survive. So we are not like a shark in this regard. Even though we've mastered our environment, we don't have a baseline of selective pressures on our bodies, only our brains. It seems that if we wanted to optimize the longevity benefits of being perfected for our environment, we would need some baseline of selective pressures that remains constant, but holds us to a certain standard of fitness. So we're different from sharks in that whereas they are not subject to selective pressures by virtue of already being perfectly selected for in an environment that maintains their form, we have completely insulated ourselves from selective pressures. It seems that if we are the masters of our environment, then we could create a situation where we could emulate the relationship between form and environment that creatures who experience negligible senescence possess. Such a condition removes the double-edged sword that is the propensity to mutate. In my last video, I talked about the alien transmission through the young pilot. And the aliens said that we on Earth were being watched by them from light years away. And that we were the most violent species out there. It seemed puzzling that that could be the case, because you would think that every other species would have had to go through the same stages. So it made me wonder how that could actually be. It would most certainly have to do with the environment in which we evolved relative to this theoretical universe of other peaceful beings. If you look at it objectively, the Earth is an incredibly savage place. We are not far removed from extremely short and uncomfortable lives. So, in evolutionary terms, we are very recently departed from a place that positively selected for savagery. Our level of consciousness is not appropriately aligned with our intelligence and inventiveness. The selective pressures on our planet are tremendous due to the abundance of biomass and the constantly changing conditions. It could also be that we have more land mass, perhaps, than other life-bearing planets. We don't know. I'm too out of my depth on this topic to assert that a planet could have life but no land, but I think others have talked about such things. I don't see why not. But it would seem that a water planet would be more stable for inhabitants than one with land. Like, for example, the dinosaurs got wiped out by a land catastrophe, but sharks have been around for 450 million years. So perhaps these other intelligent species were able to perfect their forms in a more stable environment and become like the sharks of their world. So with negligible senescence, intelligence, and this longevity to cultivate wisdom, like our relatively short lifespan, say compared to a Greenland shark with that 600-year lifespan, we are impulsive, and more so when we're young. Though this stable aquatic planet, it's debatable as to whether or not aquatic beings could even develop technology in the way that we have. But there are too many unknowns to answer that question for sure, especially as pertaining to another part of the universe. But we on Earth really are like chimps with machine guns. So if this alien transmission was real, then we have this unusual situation of being like the most violent, intelligent species in the universe. So how could a thing like this happen? I have alluded to theories given to me by my old roommate, Frank. He told me these things in the early 1990s. He believed that we were genetically modified beings, that aliens from the Pleiades came here to mine gold, and that we were their genetically engineered servants. But they eventually left us, or they died off. I don't know, but this is not an original alien theory, but I did hear it, 35 years ago or something, or 30-something years ago. And it was before it was widespread on the internet, really. He said that we were interbred with Homo, or rather, we were a mixture of alien DNA and Homo erectus. He pointed out specific populations on the Earth that had more or less alien DNA relative to Homo erectus DNA or other archaic hominids. Scientists don't talk about alien DNA, so that can't be corroborated, but there are traces of Homo erectus DNA in certain people groups, and what he told me back in the early 90s matches up with what geneticists have subsequently discovered. So if all of this is true, then perhaps we have been brought into this dangerous situation through some event that is perhaps echoed in the Book of Enoch or other accounts that speak of gods on earth. I know that there are the 7 sages in Hinduism, and of course the gods of Olympus. So maybe. I know Frank didn't make these things up. These are ideas that have been around for quite a while. For my part, I can only say that it is possible for an individual to move from unconsciousness to consciousness, but the fact that it can't be the predominant state means that our conditions won't change substantially. We have not thus far been able to come up with a way to prevent our episodic violence, but there are always people who think that through action they can impose some solution on the world. But as long as those people are unconscious themselves, it's just the same game with different players. They cause the episodic violence. Everybody has good reasons for what they do, or at least they will articulate good reasons. They justify by some grievance with origins in some offense to the body or soul. It's possible for people groups to make war using spiritual science, inverting an enemy population spiritually and locking them into a belief system that holds them in that state. A dualistic belief system where there's a subject and object relationship between the worshiper and the deity does not tend to produce conscious adherence. There's a veil woven from the binary of good and evil in the eyes of the one who, unconsciously believing themselves to be a separate self, are subject to them. This veil of preferences hides the absolute truth, coloring the perception of reality with the lens of conditioning. Only relative truths are perceived from behind the veil of positionality. This doesn't mean that an individual doesn't present in duality, but rather that they don't identify with anything that can be attacked. They don't unconsciously identify with anything that can be attacked because their identity lies in what's aware of what can be attacked, which can't even be seen, much less attacked. So a dualistic view that threatens calamity for defection from it can hold a population in unconsciousness. Although dualistic faith can spin off mystical branches and non-dualistic heresies that can lead to awakenings that manifest the fruit of the spirit of truth. Even if a religion such as this dies out at the hands of modernity and secularism, the materialism that follows also holds a dualistic worldview. It is possible that as quantum physics evolves, we'll get a better understanding of the relationship between consciousness, energy, and matter. But you have the ability to take stock of your conditioning and consider how much of what shaped you was controlled by you. Everything we see is rooted in one cause, and somehow it has all come together to give rise to an awareness that believes everything it sees. When you're in the dream, unless you're lucid, there's a belief in it being real. Everything moves except for the space in which it moves. That space is love. That space is the unchanging truth. that space is aware. You are that space. The sense in which you are made in the Creator's image is not in the form, nor the thoughts, nor the energy, but rather the awareness you are that perceives them. What can expose the non-self nature of what appears in the awareness you are?